Our topic tonight is the worst crusade, when Constantinople fell to its Christian allies. And by that, we are talking about the infamous Fourth Crusade. And when we say allies, we're meaning in the crusader sense. So crusades, the idea of them is attacking, or at least the original idea, was attacking external enemies of Christendom, which obviously the greatest city in Christendom, the Christian city of Constantinople, the Christian New Rome, was not one of those external enemies. I want to begin just with a little context with the numbered crusades. The crusades were numbered after the fact by historians, and in fact there's actually many more crusades than there are numbers, but the crusades that are deemed the most important are the ones that have numbers. So we've already had a lecture on the First Crusade, which launched the entire enterprise. It took place between 1096 and 1099. It was led not by kings, but by significant French and also Italian and German nobles, and it conquered Jerusalem and set up the entire set of crusader states. So after the Byzantines, after the East Roman Empire had lost nearly all of Anatolia, which was its traditional heartland, more than half the empire essentially, to the Seljuk Turks, Pope Urban II issued what was an unexpectedly popular call to Western knights, starting out in France, where he made the announcement, to make an armed pilgrimage to retake Jerusalem. The word crusade hadn't evolved yet and wouldn't for a little bit of time. The King of France, Philip I, and the Emperor Henry IV declined. So the crusade was led by Raymond of Toulouse, one of the most important noblemen of the French South, Bohemond of Taranto, one of the important Normans in Sicily, Godfrey of Bouillon, a northern French notable, and other French nobles. The crusade ended up being shockingly successful, which is one of the reasons why the whole enterprise got started and kept going for so many centuries past when it made any sense. And the crusade established crusader states in Edessa, in Mesopotamia, and then along the coast of the Levant, in Antioch and Tripoli, and finally a kingdom centered on the city of Jerusalem. The Second Crusade took place half a century later. Nur al-Din Zengi, the leader of the Seljuks in Syria, conquered the first of those crusader states, the county of Edessa, which was the most exposed, essentially, of them, the one that was furthest from the sea and the support of Western Europe. It was off in Mesopotamia. Zengi massacred all of the men and enslaved all the women and children in Edessa, which caused a great deal of anxiety and panic in Western Europe. So Pope Eugene III called a new crusade. Eugene previously had been a Cistercian monk and his mentor had been Bernard of Clairvaux, one of the most famous preachers in all Christian history. Bernard heavily promoted the crusade, got lots and lots of people to sign up for it, including King Conrad III of Germany and King Louis VII of France. The Crusaders wanted to retake Edessa, but when they got to the Levant, when they got to the Middle East, the local Crusaders had different ideas. So King Baldwin III of Jerusalem, one of the descendants of the original Crusaders, who are now the people that are staying and living in the Crusader kingdoms, decided to attack Damascus, which the crusade then failed to take. And so nothing was accomplished after this entire amazing outlay of money from both the kings and arms and so forth. When Nur al-Din Zengi took Damascus, which had been weakened, so one of the last remaining independent from him state, his general Saladin conquered Egypt and abolished the ailing Fatimid Caliphate. That suddenly brought all of the Muslims that had been disunified into unity. And when the general Saladin later successfully usurped the Zengid sultanates, he was able to unite Egypt and Syria under his rule. He thus became an incredibly dangerous threat to the Crusaders, who foolhardily marched their army out to fight him and were killed. Had their army destroyed at Hattin in 1187. Saladin then proceeded to conquer everything, all of the Crusader states and territories, with the exceptions of the city-states of Antioch and Tripoli. So in response, the Third Crusade was launched by all of the major ruling heads of Western Europe, so the Emperor Frederick Barbarossa, King Richard the Lionheart of England, and King Philip II Augustus of France, all led armies. Frederick Barbarossa died on the land route, so the old land route that the first Crusaders took. While he's in Anatolia, he is killed, and so his contingent, some of the people make it, but it's not the whole army ever even makes it to the Holy Land. Meanwhile, Richard the Lionhearted and the King of France traveled by sea. They were great enemies with each other. Richard was, of course, very gallant and chivalrous, and Philip was much poorer than he was and was always being outshone by him, and they tried to snipe at each other the whole time. So while Richard was on his way, he captured the island of Cyprus, which had been in rebellion. It had been a Byzantine province forever, but it was in rebellion from Constantinople, and Richard made it his own property. The crusade then successfully retook the city of Acre, which had been the most important city on the coast of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. And Acre now becomes the new capital of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, which doesn't include Jerusalem. So although Richard stayed for a long time in the east and sparred with Saladin's forces, and so this is almost the most famous moment of two great chivalrous generals facing off, a king and a sultan facing off against each other. Richard was not able to make any progress in taking Jerusalem and had to go home without doing it. As Richard left, he concluded really that nobody would be able to make any progress on getting Jerusalem or keeping Jerusalem safe unless the Crusaders conquered Egypt, which was Saladin's base. And so Pope Innocent III, when he called the next crusade, the Fourth Crusade, he had that object in mind. And having had a string of not so successful crusades led by kings, Innocent looked once again to nobles to lead a crusade so that perhaps he would have more control over it than he would have if a king were leading it. This is the crusade that we're talking about tonight, the Fourth Crusade, so then we'll just go on, we'll talk about that in more detail. The Fifth Crusade actually also was still trying to get to Egypt. The Fourth Crusade never made it to Egypt. This time the Crusaders actually invaded Egypt, but Saladin's dynasty, the Ayyubids, who were still in charge, opened the Nile sluices at the Battle of Mansoura, which forced the Crusaders to surrender when the Nile Delta was flooded and prevented them from attacking and or even being able to escape. Emperor Frederick II, who was supposed to lead the crusade, never actually showed up, and so nothing was accomplished in the Fifth Crusade. And the Sixth Crusade Frederick finally actually did make his way to the east on crusade, but rather than fight anybody really, he had long established diplomatic relations with Saladin's heir, Al-Kamil, who gave Jerusalem back to him using diplomacy, as long as it was not defended or armed and Muslims were still allowed to go there. It was a solution that restored Jerusalem to Christian hands, but it wasn't one that Crusaders were very happy with, because they wanted to take it the way they'd always taken it, by force of arms and have it be a military victory, which this was instead a diplomatic victory. And the last of the numbered Crusades, led by King Louis IX, famous Saint Louis of France, again tried to conquer Egypt, and again failed. And in fact, Louis got captured and had to be ransomed, and so the crusade ended up gaining nothing and losing lots and lots of money. So that's the kind of history of the numbered Crusades. Obviously, there were many more smaller crusades between the numbered ones, but in general, after the wildly successful First Crusade, the Crusades represented enormous, actually increasing amounts of investment for increasingly meager gains. So the exception of all of those failing later Crusades in terms of return on investment is the crusade that achieved perhaps the biggest, or not perhaps, just the biggest, richest conquest of them all, but it did so by allowing itself to be hijacked from its original objective, Jerusalem by way of conquering Egypt, so the Fourth Crusade. So the Fourth Crusade, like I say, took place after Richard the Lionheart and the other Third Crusaders had been able to reestablish a kingdom of Jerusalem as a group of kind of the shoreline, focused in the middle there at the city of Acre, which is just north of Haifa now in modern Israel. So, a little bit of background. Constantinople, which the Fourth Crusade took, from its founding by the Emperor Constantine in the year 330, or refounding. It had previously been the Greek city of Byzantium, Byzantion. The Roman Empire's eastern capital, the New Rome, the New Christian Rome, had never fallen to an invading army. But in 1203, as the empire had gone into very serious decline, the city still had hundreds of thousands of inhabitants and an amazing store of accumulated artifacts and wealth. Our best source for the Fourth Crusade is a first-hand account written by one of the knights who took part in it, Geoffrey of Villehardouin. Geoffrey reported in his chronicle when the Crusaders first arrived at Constantinople, "You may imagine how they gazed, all those who had never before seen Constantinople. For when they saw those high ramparts and strong towers, with which it was completely encircled, and the splendid palaces and the soaring churches, so many that but for the evidence of their own eyes they would never believe it. And the length and breadth of that city, which of all others is sovereign, the city of cities. They, the Crusaders, never thought that there could be so rich and powerful a place in the world. And mark you, there was not a man so bold that he did not tremble at the sight. Nor was this any wonder, for never since the creation of the world was there so great an enterprise as the city of Constantinople." So at this point in the Middle Ages, Rome had been reduced to a ruined shadow of its former self, with perhaps 35,000 inhabitants. Paris, the capital of France, which was growing and was a major center, had just 110,000 inhabitants to Constantinople's 400,000 or so at this time. So Geoffrey, the Crusader here, further notes that during the fighting, when the Crusaders set fire to the city in 1204, there were more houses burnt in Constantinople than there are to be found in the three greatest cities of the Kingdom of France. So if you took all of the houses in the three top cities, Paris and the next two cities in France, all of the houses, there would be fewer than the ones that, just the number that burned in Constantinople during the Crusade. And so the loss was incalculable. The assessment of the Crusaders themselves was that Constantinople had been the greatest city in Christendom, completely dwarfing any of the cities that they were familiar with in the Latin West. From the Byzantine side, contemporary historian Nicetas Choniates lamented, "How shall I begin to tell the deeds wrought by these nefarious men, the Crusaders? Alas, the images which ought to have been adored were trodden underfoot. Alas, the relics of the holy martyrs were thrown into unclean places. Then was seen what one shudders to hear, namely, the divine body and blood of Christ was spilled upon the ground or thrown about, so the Eucharist was not being cared for properly. They, the Crusaders, snatched the precious reliquaries, thrust into their bosoms the ornaments which these contained, so they looted all of the ancient relics of all the martyrs, and used the broken remnants for pans and drinking cups, precursors of Antichrist, authors and heralds of his nefarious deeds, which we momentarily expect." So for the chronicler here, the fall of Constantinople is a sign that the end times are here. And these are the precursors of the Antichrist, which are foretelling, the second coming, the end of the world, the apocalypse. Nor, he continues, can the violation of the great church, Hagia Sophia, be listened to with equanimity, for the sacred altar, formed of all kinds of precious materials and admired by the whole world, was broken into bits and distributed among the soldiers, as was all the other sacred wealth of so great and infinite splendor. No one was without a share in the grief. In the alleys, in the streets, in the temples, complaints, weeping, lamentations, grief, the groaning of men, the shrieks of women, wounds, rape, captivity, the separation of those most closely united. Nobles wandered about ignominiously, those of venerable age in tears, the rich in poverty. Thus it was in the streets, on the corners, in the temple, in the dens, for no place remained unassailed or defended the suppliants. All places everywhere were filled full of all kinds of crimes. O immortal God, how great the afflictions of the men, bow great the distress. All right, an amazing and terrible destruction of the greatest city of medieval Christendom. How did it come to pass? How did Crusaders go from Crusaders to Antichrist, at least in the perspective of the Christians of the Greek East? Well, let's look at first at the original concept of what a crusade is. The idea grew out of the Gregorian reforms, which had effectively elevated the papacy from a very low early medieval focus that popes had had on local Italian politics. So the reformers were able to pull the papacy out of its extremely low ebb and set its sights very high, ultimately aspiring to leadership of the Latin West. The reformers built on a truce of God movement that had been flourishing by the clerics in southern France, where clerics tried to get Christian knights that are constantly fighting each other, and generally speaking, as they fought each other, robbing each other's peasants in order to deprive the other of wealth and goods, which actually hurt the people a lot more than it hurt the knights. The clerics tried to get the knights to agree to certain rules and to have truces. So, for example, not to attack each other on Sunday or during Easter or certain times and so on. And so now, built on that kind of beginning, the idea of crusade is to give knights who are now at peace with one another an external opponent so that they can accomplish their goal of fighting or their purpose of fighting, their external opponent being the Muslims. So as I say, the papacy was at its medieval nadir, should be medieval with an A, between 867 and 1049. Essentially, it was passed back and forth between local noble families in the papal state, the area around Rome, and when they controlled it, when they were able to put one of their own on the papal throne, he was able to distribute the papacy's wealth as a kind of spoil system for that faction. Just a couple examples of the worst of the bad popes from this time period. Stephen VI, infamously exhumed, unburied, and tried his predecessor, Pope Formosus, in what was called the Cadaver Synod, because the body of Formosus was redressed in papal finery and was tried, found guilty of being a heretic, and then was punished and thrown in the Tiber River. And after that, they went back and forth, and people were either pro-Formosan or afterwards in terms of the factions as they fought in the century following. Another example, Benedict the Ninth, whose father bribed the electors in order to get him to be pope in the first place, decided that he didn't really like it that much, and so he sold being pope to his godfather, Gregory VI, in 1045. And then he thought, well, wait a second, actually I want to be pope after all, and so he attacked Rome and tried to depose Gregory VI, and so fought over it. This kind of the popes having open mistresses and just not living in any way as clerics or morally caused the reputation of the papacy to sink. And this is also the time period when things like the myth of Pope Joan are set or takes place in this kind of chaos time of the bad popes. It's actually the kings of Germany who intervened in Italy and stabilized the papacy while simultaneously claiming the West Roman crown for themselves in the 11th century, in the 1000s. So the popes allies with Charlemagne had revived the West Roman Empire by crowning Charlemagne in the year 800. Several of Charlemagne's heirs, the Carolingians, had also been crowned as emperors. Ultimately, the Carolingian, the Frankish kingdom, was divided, and it had kind of two lasting components. In the west, the Kingdom of France, in the east, the Kingdom of Germany. And the German kings were able to take control of Italy. In that low point of the papacy, again, local nobles sometimes were able to get the popes to crown them emperor, even though they were really only in control of a local county in Italy or something like that. Now the kings of Germany establish control over Germany and Italy and are named emperor. And Conrad II of Germany put his first cousin, a German nobleman named Bruno, on the papal throne, who became Leo IX, who reigned in the middle of the 11th century. And Leo was the first really strong pope in centuries. So this established papal stability, and it put conditions in place for the revolutionary reforms of Pope Gregory VII a little later on. So Gregory the Seventh reigned a couple popes after Leo, and during his rule, when it was this is where we get the title or the name Gregorian Reforms, he outlined his own expansive theory of papal power in a document called the Dictatus Papae, the Dictates of the Pope. There are 27 dictates, and among these are: 1, that the Roman Church is founded by the Lord alone. 2, that the Roman pontiff alone is called universal by right. 3, that he, the Pope, alone can depose or reconcile bishops. So he's got power to unseat all of the other bishops below him. Number 7, that it is for him alone is it licit, according to necessity of time, to establish new laws. So emperors had always been a font of laws and lawmaking, and sometimes this fell to kings as well. So kings and emperors are the ones who had the capacity to make laws. The popes now are claiming the capacity to make new laws, especially canon laws for the church, governing the church. But not only. So Gregory VII says he alone, the Pope alone, can use the imperial insignia, that all princes are to kiss the feet of the Pope alone, that for him it is licit to depose emperors. So they are put over emperors and can actually depose them, that he himself must be judged by no one, and that he can absolve the subjects of the iniquitous from fidelity. And so as we are living in this time of feudalism, where medieval empires and kingdoms are largely operated through bonds of fealty, where you have an oath of fidelity as a noble to obey a king, or as a bishop to obey your king or your emperor, the Pope can absolve that oath, and suddenly you have no right to claim the fealty, the fidelity of your vassals. So pretty revolutionary stuff. So while it's one thing to say that you have all this power, so the Dictatus Papae is a document of legal theory. So these are hypothetical powers. These are things that Gregory VII is claiming on behalf of the papacy. Gregory also understood that in order to make actual authority real, you have to use those powers. And so Gregory put it to the test in 1076 when he decided to excommunicate the Emperor Henry IV, the German emperor. And in so doing, he also released all of the emperor's vassals from their oaths of fealty while Gregory and Henry were having a fight. And so the emperor immediately found the emperor tried to simply depose Gregory as well, but he actually found that Gregory's act had caused a significant rebellion among his vassals, people who thought, well, maybe we can get rid of this emperor and maybe one of us will be able to become emperor. The emperor was only able to regain his throne by humbling himself, traveling to Italy, and appearing as a humble penitent before the Pope at the castle of Canossa in 1077. So here's a picture of this famous incident where the emperor is, essentially waiting for days barefoot outside the castle of the Pope, trying to be forgiven. So the Pope was allied with Henry's rebellious vassals, and he hoped to travel to Germany so that he could hold a court and depose, declare final judgment on the emperor and depose him and pick a new emperor. But because the emperor appeared this way as a penitent, barefoot in the snow, Gregory was forced to restore him to full communion, which restored his vassals and essentially betrayed the Pope's allies who had taken all the risk of rebelling when Gregory absolved them of their oaths of fealty. So having abandoned his allies, this first case, it turns out then in the subsequent decade, as the Pope fought Henry again and tried to excommunicate him again and tried to cause rebellion again among the vassals, the subsequent excommunications didn't have the same effect. And so Henry was able to maintain his position without having to be penitent again. Nevertheless, both sides kind of won by losing. So although Henry won politically, was able to keep his throne and didn't have to worry about the Pope being able to excommunicate him anymore, nevertheless, the papacy won in terms of having a very powerful precedent, the precedent of being able to depose emperors. And so this will just kind of show you the importance of all this. I'm putting all this background because the Reformed papacy is really important to understand why there are crusades and how we could get to the Fourth Crusade, the conquest of Constantinople. So Leo IX is that first stable pope we were mentioning. There's 4 popes later is Gregory the Seventh, the guy who wrote the Dictatus Papae, the person for whom the Gregorian reform is named, the person who tries to depose the emperor. Then there's only one pope between him and Urban II, that reform pope who called the First Crusade. So you can just see how this leads very rapidly to the institution of having crusades. Then 7 popes later, Pope Eugene III is the pope that called the Second Crusade, Gregory VIII, the Third Crusade, and Innocent III, the Fourth Crusade that we're talking about. So Urban II's initiation of this really powerful tool, what becomes a very powerful tool in the papal arsenal, the ability to call the knights of Europe forward and even the kings of Europe forward in the cause of a crusade. That took place just 2 decades after Canossa, after the emperor humbled himself before Pope Gregory. So the right to initiate a crusade became a very significant power, and like I say, Eugene III called the Second Crusade, and Gregory VIII called the Third. So the institution of crusading was very well established, and the right of the popes to call them was very well established by the time Innocent III came along and called the Fourth Crusade. So Innocent III is one of the most kind of interesting and fascinating medieval popes and medieval characters. He represents almost the pinnacle, the height of medieval papal authority. So just a century or so after the Gregorian reform began in Gregory VII's reign, most all of those theoretical powers that he had claimed for the papacy were pretty much realized in Innocent III. Reformed popes had built on the precedent of Gregory's deposition of the emperor, Henry IV, and now they claimed the right to depose and replace emperors, and actually other kings too sometimes, as well as to intervene in election of new emperors, and that's what Innocent himself did in 1203, just after coming to his own throne. So, like I say, just whereas the German emperors had once been the powerful ones who had actually intervened and replaced these unsuitable local popes with their own candidates like Leo, Innocent now chose who would be emperor. And so here is a decree that he wrote in terms of choosing who the German king would be. He says, "It is the business of the Pope to look after the interests of the Roman Empire, since the empire derives its origin and its final authority from the papacy. Its origin, because the empire was originally transferred from Greece by and for the sake of the papacy." So it was the Pope who, at the time of Charlemagne, deposed or declared that the empire of the East was defunct, and now the crown is going to return to the West, and he crowns Charlemagne. So The popes have power over saying who's pope, and indeed they are the ones who initiated that. And then the papacy also has the final authority because the emperor is raised to his position by the pope, who blesses him, crowns him, and invests him with the empire. So by saying even invests him with the empire, the implication is that the Roman Empire, we mean here the Holy Roman Empire, the Empire of Germany and Italy, it's like in saying invest, it's almost essentially like a fief of the papacy. The Pope is the emperor's overlord, is what Innocent III is trying to say. So the previous emperor, Henry VI, who had also become king of Sicily, had been an incredibly powerful emperor. So Henry VI was the son of Frederick Barbarossa, and that had made him a potentially very dangerous enemy of the papacy, or if he wasn't, as he could have been the enemy, he was certainly threatened papal authority. But Henry VI and his wife Constance, the daughter of King Roger II of Sicily, died in 1187. They had united the kingdom of Sicily, which included all of southern Italy, including Naples, and Sicily, and was incredibly powerful at this time, the Norman kingdom of Sicily. It had united that together with the empire. But when they died, their 4-year-old son Frederick, while he was king of Sicily, he was left in the care of none other than Innocent III, because they were afraid that a child in his minority might just be deposed and returned to the male Norman dynasty. So Innocent was thus left to intervene in the choice of who the emperor would be, and rather than choose Frederick, who was a 4-year-old kid, he said, okay, that's one of the possibilities. The other possibility is Henry's brother, Philip of Swabia, who many of the barons had chosen. And the other possibility is the head of another imperial house, the Welfs, Otto of Brunswick. And so Innocent said, Philip of Swabia is a terrible and innocent. He never, and insolent. He never obeys anything that I say, so he definitely is out. Frederick is a little kid, so he's out. And the Welfs have been so loyal and obedient to the popes that I will choose Otto. And so he names Otto as the new king of the Romans, the king of Germany, and ultimately makes him the emperor. So it is Innocent that has the power to make who the emperor is. That said, Philip of Swabia continues to consider himself to be king, and he and Otto have a civil war as they try to, in Germany, as they try to each take the throne. Okay. Oh, meanwhile, this Frederick that we mentioned, he's just a little kid, but he grows up to be Frederick II of Sicily. He ultimately becomes the emperor, and he is the leader of that crusade that I mentioned when he is able to reclaim Jerusalem by diplomacy. It is an amazing kind of feat. He's doing that at the time as an emperor who's been excommunicated by the Pope as the great enemy of the papacy. And ultimately, this house of Hohenstaufens, the Swabians, the house that Philip and Frederick represent, is considered to be the great enemy of the papacy, and the popes ultimately are able to have it destroyed, or they're able to fight it to the death. And so the Hohenstaufens give their name in the Italian politics to the Ghibellines, and the Welfs give their name in the Italian politics to the Guelphs. And so in Italian factionalism in the Middle Ages, your cities and your faction is either Guelph or Ghibelline, and whether you are kind of pro-imperial power or pro-papal power. Okay. So we're getting to the Fourth Crusade here. So this was the kind of authority that Innocent was wielding as he called the Fourth Crusade. So, like I say, in the decade after Richard the Lionheart had left the Levant for home, the Crusader states had recovered some additional ports. So there had been that, the red part was when Richard left, and then there's a pink part, Jaffa, Sidon, Beirut, and so forth, that they were able to expand it. But the locals had been able to make no additional progress towards reclaiming Jerusalem, and they had to settle for making a truce with Saladin's heirs, the Ayyubids, Sultanate of Egypt. So Innocent intended to raise a major new effort, a major new crusade, and as Richard had sort of opined or strategized, wanted the target to be Egypt itself, so that Egypt would now be a new crusader kingdom that would allow the kingdom of Jerusalem to be revived and to be kept safe, because the crusaders, the Christians, would now control Egypt. So who was to lead the crusade? Which knights were to lead the crusade? So Otto IV, who Innocent had named as emperor, was busy fighting Philip of Swabia in Germany, and the kings of England and France were at war with each other. King Philip Augustus of France was still on the throne. He's now fighting Richard's brother, the terrible King John. And Philip has no interest of going back on a crusade. He's already been on a crusade, and John is kind of dawdling. He was never going to go on a crusade either. So Innocent decided to go back to the model that had occurred in the First Crusade, where the crusade is led by great nobles rather than by kings. So Count Thibaut of Champagne was elected to lead the crusade, but before he could get going, he died in 1201. And he was replaced as leader by Boniface I, the Marquis of Montferrat, which is a rich noble land in northern Italy, northwestern Italy. So while the First Crusade had reached Syria and Palestine by land, having marched all the way across from Germany through the Balkans and Anatolia, and as recently as the Third Crusade, the Germans had tried to do that again. Frederick Barbarossa did that, but his death en route in Anatolia made this whole kind of land route less attractive as compared to the sea route that Richard the Lionheart and Philip Augustus had taken. And so it was decided, especially since they're going to Egypt anyway, which is all the way on the other side of the whole thing from Anatolia, it would be a lot easier to just take ships. But the problem would be, how do you have enough ships to transport all of the tens of thousands of crusaders that Innocent wants to send? He's the biggest pope ever. He wants to send and have the biggest crusade ever. The answer was to negotiate with the various maritime republics. So Genoa, one of the great maritime republics, declined to participate, but the Venetian Republic was willing to contract to transport the entire crusade, and this was on terms that were proposed by Venice's leader, Doge Enrico Dandolo. So the Doge says, we will build transports to carry 4,500 horses, 9,000 squires, and ships for 4,500 knights and 20,000 sergeants of foot. So for 33,500 crusaders total plus horses. We will also agree to purvey food for these horses and people during 9 months. This is what we undertake to do at the least, on the condition that you pay us for each horse 4 marks and for each man 2 marks. Now, the sum total of the expense above named amounts to 85,000 marks, a huge princely sum, but for a big cost, too, of what they're willing to do. And he said, this we will do moreover. For the love of God, we will add to the fleet, from our own expense, 50 armed galleys filled with Venetians, on the condition that, so long as we act in company, all conquests in land or money, whether at sea or on dry ground, we shall have the half, and you shall have the other half. So the leaders of the crusade agree to Venice's terms. They agree anyway that Venice should be able to get 3/8 of all of the conquests. And over the course of the next year, the Venetian Republic invested an enormous amount of capital building the necessary transports and war galleys to outfit just an enormous crusade. So Venice fulfilled its component of the bargain by the year 1202. And again, as the crusader Geoffrey of Villehardouin says in his chronicle, the fleet that they built that they had got ready was so goodly and so fine that never did Christian man see one goodlier or finer, as well as galleys as transports. Unfortunately, less than a third of the anticipated number of crusaders had answered the summons and made their way to Venice. Just 12,000 instead of the expected or needed 33,500. So this is sort of seeing the wane of the interest in crusading. So when there had been, when the first couple times the Crusades were done, the preaching stirred people's hearts. Now this is something that is happening more frequently and with less great results. It costs a lot of money, as people have seen. They've seen lots of previous crusaders ruined by these, and dynasties and noble houses toppled because of these things. And so there's less interest in them, and so fewer people show up than Innocent would have wanted. Unfortunately, in terms of the contract that had been made with the Venetians, this means that the Crusaders had insufficient funds. So just 35,000 of the promised 85,000 silver marks. The Venetians refused to sail just a part of this great fleet that they had built for anything less than the full amount of the contract. And while the Crusaders waited for either more arrivals or attempted to raise additional funds, they were very rapidly in danger of eating through their supplies and money that they have, and the summer months waned. So finally, the Doge proposed an alternate way that the Crusaders could repay their debt to Venice. Maybe find a different way to pay for your debt. Let's put Venice into a little bit of context. Venice is an amazing city and one of the most amazing places to go visit even today. We've done a whole lecture on Venice. It's be fun to look up. Most of the larger cities of the medieval Latin West, Palermo was actually one of the largest cities, which is at this time the capital of the Norman Kingdom of Sicily, which was incredibly rich. Paris, the capital of France, Florence, Cologne in Germany, Bologna, Rome itself. All of these cities had been cities at the time of the Roman Empire's fall. But Venice, which was one of the largest of these, was the exception. Venice has its origins in the Roman refugees who fled the Lombard conquest of the Italian mainland and founded a new city where they could defend themselves on an island in the marshes. So along with Naples, Amalfi, Gaeta, and Rome, Venice was never conquered by the Lombards and thus remained kind of an outpost of the Eastern Roman Empire. And then as the Eastern Roman Empire further declined and neglected them, it became an autonomous part of the empire, and finally it became functionally and then really independent. And so you can kind of see here in this map, which is at the time of the was always incomplete Lombard conquest, circa 740, so in the 8th century. The Lombard kingdom proper was in the north, where the Lombards had the most of their strength. And then they established two semi-independent duchies of Spoleto and Benevento, Lombard principalities that were on the other side of the space between the Exarchate of Ravenna and Rome. So this was the part that was controlled or maintained by the Eastern Roman Empire. And later, when the Franks conquered the Lombard kingdom and that became part of Charlemagne's empire, then this lower area of Benevento became independent Lombard principalities that ultimately fell to the Normans, who conquered that and created the Norman kingdom. Essentially, though, what happened was that because the Lombards, unlike the Ostrogoths, the Lombards failed to take the whole thing, and because the empire continued to maintain these little toeholds, Italy ceased to be unified and wasn't unified again until the 19th century unification. And even so, after all of the century or so, a couple centuries that Italy's been nominally unified, it's still pretty disunified as a country in modern times. And this dates from this incomplete conquest by the Lombards. So one of the roles that these little outposts like Amalfi and Gaeta and Venice started to take on was outfitting boats, ships for sea voyages, and beginning to revive sort of merchant trade routes across the Mediterranean, trading with the Byzantines and the Muslim powers. There wasn't a lot of wealth in the West, and so one of the things that they were doing was slave trading. So they took depopulated Italians from the countryside originally and sold them as slaves in Egypt, and later they raided Croatia and Serbia for Slavic slaves to sell before finally getting more trade goods where they were wealthier as time went on, as the Latin West recovered. So that recovery took place kind of hand in hand with the Crusades, and in the wake of the Crusades, as the West expanded to the other side of Byzantium and had these new colonial outposts in Syria, Palestine, they needed to be supported by these mercantile republics. And so Genoa, Venice, and Pisa emerged as mercantile republics with powerful navies of their own. Like I say, the Crusader states were ports for these republics, and they also, though, had trading interests in Byzantium and Egypt. So as the Fourth Crusade was gathering at Venice, in secret, the Venetian ambassadors were actually in Egypt trying to negotiate a trade agreement with the vizier of El-Adil I, the Sultan of Egypt. This was the younger brother of Saladin. Saladin had died in 1193, and so now Al-Adil is in charge. He's prepared to make a major trade pact with the Venetians, but obviously one of the things that the Venetians would be promising is, well, we won't be part of the crusade that is going to attack you, any crusading that's going to attack Egypt. So while Venice was always wary of all of these commercial rivals like Genoa and Pisa and so on, it became the strongest of the mercantile republics. As a republic, it included an elected monarchy. So the word doge is the vernacular Venetian Italian word for duke, so it really just means duke, but it's an elected duke, elected for life, and the doges were elected through a remarkably Byzantine system. And so if you haven't seen our lecture on Venice, it's a lot of fun to go through the system and how the election actually took place. So in 1202, the doge was Enrico Dandolo, who was already a very elderly man. He'd already gone blind, but he nevertheless displayed a tremendous energy and mental capacity. So because even though Innocent and the Crusader leaders wanted to take Egypt, they had kept the actual destination of the crusade secret, because popularly, knights really only wanted to retake Jerusalem. And so they were worried that if the destination of Egypt was mentioned, nobody would sign up at all. And I mean, they had a good reason to worry, since so few signed up, so many fewer signed up than they thought or they hoped for. Like I say, the Doge was negotiating a trade agreement with Egypt, which almost certainly would have included a promise not to take part in crusades that were focused on attacking Egypt. And so it is not really clear what the Doge's original plan would have been, since he was simultaneously negotiating with both Egypt and the Crusaders. But he came up with a plan that worked out. So like Venice itself, the city of Zara, or Zadar, on the Adriatic had once been an outpost of Byzantium. And as the Venetians had become independent, Zara had also gotten its own autonomy and independence, and the Venetians continuously attempted to subjugate Zara, and indeed they tried to take control of as much as they can any rivals that existed in the Adriatic, so that they could dominate their home sea, the Adriatic. This caused the people of Zara to seek alliances with the Croatians and the Hungarians, and by the time of the Crusade, the Fourth Crusade, Zara was a possession of the King of Hungary and protected by the King of Hungary. And the Hungarians are, of course, a Christian kingdom, and a Latin Christian kingdom. So the Doge proposed that the Crusaders could pay off some of their debt that they owed by helping him recover Zara. So it's on the way. We'll just show off the flag at Trieste and just show how the Triestians should continue to be loyal to Venice. Then we'll go to Zadar, to Zara, and conquer it, and so on as we go, and that will help you pay off your debt. So some of the Crusaders flat out refused. So given, like I say, that the entire concept of crusading was for knights to focus their energy on non-Christians, and the people of Zara were Christians, the Hungarians were Christians. Well, the King of Hungary was himself a crusader. Many of the knights of the crusade, many of the leaders, refused and left the crusade, or defected and went on their own crusades. And these included Enguerrand III, Lord of Coucy, one of the major French nobles of the north, as well as Simon V of Montfort. So they refused to continue. They made their way instead to Acre, to the Kingdom of Jerusalem. But unfortunately, they had so few knights with them when they arrived that King Amory of Jerusalem, who had negotiated a truce with the Ayyubid Sultan of Egypt, he refused to let the Crusaders attack anybody because that would break the truce. And there's not enough Crusaders to defend against the response that would happen if the Egyptians broke the truce, or responded to the breaking of the truce. Nevertheless, the bulk of the Crusaders agreed, and many of them likely even looked forward to the possibility of looting a city. After all, they are warriors, they're knights, and one of the ways that knights made money was through spoils. And so the bulk of the army was transported by the Venetians to Zara and reached the unsuspecting city by November the 11th. So after just a brief siege, Zara fell on the 24th and was sacked and extensively pillaged. And as a kind of a sign of how things would go in the crusade as it went on, the Venetians and the Crusaders came to blows as they fought over the division of the loot, but they were finally able to resolve who got what. So when the Pope, when Innocent III, who was nominally in charge of this crusade, who had called this crusade into being, who wanted Egypt conquered, heard of the plan to go to Zara, he was absolutely horrified. and he sent a letter forbidding the attack. The leaders didn't show the members of the crusade that because they didn't want to, they wanted to go ahead and do it. So upon learning that he'd been defied, the Pope responded by excommunicating both the Crusaders and the Venetians, and so now this is a excommunicated crusade. Although he then thought better of it, and he decided that the real blame was on the Venetians, that the Crusaders had been tricked. So he lifted the Crusaders' excommunication, but he left the Venetians excommunicated. This more or less meant that the crusade could go on. A lot of crusaders obviously cared about whether they're excommunicated by the Pope. These were guys who were, in some cases, very motivated. They took the cross in order to be part of, it's a militant and violent expedition, but it has a religious basis to it, including a kind of respect for papal authorities for some of them. Many of them are just opportunists, but many of them are there for important religious considerations. The Venetians, not so much. They were much more able to take, and they're more used to getting excommunicated, and it didn't worry them as much. So the leader of the crusade, Boniface of Montferrat, he hadn't gone to Zara. It's not clear in the sources why he hadn't been part of the attack, but he instead had been visiting with his cousin, his first cousin, Philip of Swabia, who you might remember, again, was that rival for the throne of Germany, so the guy who the Pope specifically did not pick to be emperor, and instead picked Otto IV. So Boniface now arrived at Zara with Philip's brother-in-law, Prince Alexios Angelos, who is the son, or Angelos, who is the son of the recently deposed Byzantine Emperor, Isaac II Angelos. And so now this young prince, this Byzantine prince, the brother-in-law of King Philip of Germany, relative of Boniface of Montferrat, the prince has an offer for the Crusaders, another offer to pay off the Crusaders' debt. So let's look a little bit at the imperial dynasties, west and east. I'll note here, I've been saying the German emperor, and I've sometimes talked about the Holy Roman Empire, and I've talked about the East Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire. So Holy Roman Empire and Byzantine Empire are modern terms that are applied by historians for convenience to distinguish between these two claimants to be the Roman Empire. So when you're reading the sources themselves, the Germans and the popes talk about, we read in that letter by Innocent, he's talking about the Roman Empire, and he means what we would call the German Empire or the Holy Roman Empire. He just calls it the Roman Empire. Likewise, the Greeks, the Byzantines, they call themselves the Romans, and they call their empire the Roman Empire. And they call the Westerners Franks, and the Westerners call the Roman Byzantines Greeks. So in other words, these are partisan terms. I use the terms of convenience because otherwise I would just be saying Romans for both groups. So the House of Hohenstaufen was one of the main imperial dynasties for the Western Empire, the emperors of Germany. And so, like I say, Philip of Swabia, who is the uncle of, Frederick II of Sicily, is king of Germany, or a competing king of Germany with Otto. He's cousins with the Crusades leader, Boniface, the Marquis of Montferrat. So Philip is married to a Byzantine princess, Irene Angelina, and her brother is this Byzantine prince who shows up at the crusade at Zara, Alexios Angelos. Their father, Isaac II, had been the emperor of Constantinople, but he had been deposed by his brother, Alexios Angelos, who was emperor at the time of the crusade. And that should say at the top of that, the House of Angelos, not Byzantium, not Hohenstaufen. All right, those are the dynasties. Let's get a little continuity for the East Roman Empire, and why, even though it had complete continuity with the Roman Empire, it had changed very significantly by the time we're getting to the Crusades. So the empire had been divided multiple times. It's divided once again in the time of Theodosius into West and East. And the West fell in the 5th century, or collapsed under the invasions of essentially their own mercenaries, and then also barbarians on the other side of the Germanic tribes on the other side of the frontier, and was established in their wake the Germanic kingdoms of the Ostrogoths, the Visigoths, the Franks, and the Vandals especially, as the major kind of successors. Meanwhile, the Eastern Empire got through it more or less intact, and later in the 6th century, under the Emperor Justinian I, Justinian the Great, the guy who built Hagia Sophia, so one of the best known medieval emperors, Justinian destroyed the kingdom of the Vandals and the Ostrogoths, reconquering North Africa and Italy and a little part of Spain for the East Roman Empire, kind of in a way reestablishing the Eastern Empire as the Roman Empire. In retrospect, though, this was a mistake, I would say. For one thing, the destruction of the Ostrogothic kingdom of Italy really ended what had been a fairly developed Roman successor kingdom. So even though it wasn't technically part of the empire, it was it had moved into being a medieval kingdom fairly seamlessly. So the Roman administration was fairly intact. Now, after the wars necessary of destroying the Ostrogoths, Italy is kind of ravaged and ruined and becomes kind of a poor province of the Eastern Roman Empire. And same thing, the Eastern Empire itself, by having these outposts that aren't really valuable, weakens itself, especially in regards to its fight with its great Eastern rival, the Persian Empire. And so then in the 7th century, after the East Roman Empire and Persia fight a series of just devastating wars that leave both of them exhausted and vulnerable, their Arab mercenaries joined up with the zealous forces of Muhammad's successors in Arabia, who burst out of the desert and conquer Persia entirely and take from the Romans the whole of Syria, Palestine, Egypt, North Africa, and also travel into Spain and destroy the Visigothic kingdom. So the energy of the Arab Caliphate breaks against the formidable walls of Constantinople. So for a generation, the whole force of the Caliphate is, building fleets and fielding land armies in order to try to take Constantinople, and it never falls. Its strategic location, connecting the Black and Aegean Seas, along with connecting Asia and Europe, allowed what remained of the Roman state to hold out long after Persia and all the other ancient empires were history. Nevertheless, it's pretty tiny remnant, right? So when we look here, around the year 717, Constantinople has remained, but the empire lost most of Italy to the Lombards, who we mentioned, and who invaded as troops were taken away to hold against the Arabs. Same thing, they lost the Balkans and even Greece to the Slavs, who overran the whole thing. And so only Anatolia was left as kind of the empire's sole remaining heartland. And like I say, while this state retains essentially legal and civic continuity with the Roman Empire, it's undergone a lot of changes. And so, for example, Greek has now replaced Latin as its official language, and so on. From this kind of low point, they're able to regroup in Anatolia and retake much of the Balkans, and so there is a resurgence in coming centuries. But when the Seljuks appeared on the scene, the empire was faced with a very new existential threat. So the Turks had come from Central Asia, from steppes that were climatologically very similar to Anatolia. And so whereas the Arabs, which had come out of the Arabian desert, found Anatolia to be a hostile climate, the Turks found it to be just exactly like home, and they quickly made it their home, especially after the Byzantine emperor led his entire army to try to defeat them or to stop them. And it was destroyed, and he was captured at Manzikert, causing the whole empire to collapse all the way to the Aegean coast. So that's where things were at the time of the First Crusade. So if you remember, that empire that just a couple hundred years earlier, 300 years earlier, had been reduced to only having Asia Minor, only having Anatolia and Constantinople almost. Now it's lost all of Anatolia, and all it has left is the reclaimed parts of the Balkans. And so you can see it's been teetering a lot through these whole time periods. The Crusade being successful, it wasn't exactly what the Byzantines wanted at all, and certainly they were scared that the crusading army, frankly, was going to try to take Constantinople as it went through. They were able to, in the wake of the Crusade, conquer much of the coast back from the Turks, but they were never able to regain the interior of Anatolia, which now slowly Turkified the local population as the population converted to Turkish names and Turkish customs and language and the religion. So, like I say, at the eve of the Fourth Crusade, as we kind of zoom in on this map, you can see the locations between Venice on the upper left and the Byzantine Empire, now reduced to just the area around Constantinople and Greece and just very western Anatolia, the coast of Anatolia, and some other pockets, especially now because of, again, renewed rebellions among the Serbs and the Bulgarians who were independent again. And you can see in the interior of Anatolia the Seljuk Turks that are there, the Turks of Rome. That's where we are at the eve of the Crusade, a much, much reduced Byzantine Empire. So this Byzantine prince, Alexius Angelos, joins the Crusade at Zara, and he has a great offer. He offers to pay the entire debt the Crusaders owed to the Venetians, and to give the Crusaders an additional 2,000 marks of silver if they divert their crusade to Constantinople and restore his deposed father, Isaac II, to the throne. So once Isaac is on the throne, Alexius says that he will himself join the crusade along with 10,000 Byzantine troops, and they would continue from Constantinople to wherever they're going. They think they're going to Jerusalem. You know, the leaders know that they're trying to get to Egypt. So to sweeten that deal, that wasn't sweet enough, paying the debt and promising to join the crusade, Alexius further promised that he would end the schism between the Catholic West, the Latin West, and the Greek Orthodox East by giving in. So he would subordinate all of the Greek church to the papacy. He would agree to papal supremacy. As you might imagine, you know, when I gave you that context of the Reformed papacy, it's kind of the Reformed papacy that is causing the schism, because it's the Reformed papacy that is articulating a much more severe legal idea of papal supremacy. If popes are claiming not only to be able to depose the Roman Emperor of the West, they can also depose, in their claim, the Roman Emperor of the East, the Emperor of Constantinople. They also claim to be able to depose all subordinate bishops and the Patriarch of Constantinople is one of those subordinate bishops in the papal claim. They also claim that the popes can alone be called universal, so the claim of the Patriarchs of Constantinople to be the ecumenical patriarchs is also denied by the Reformed papacy. So you can imagine why then the break of the church actually happens when that very first pope that we talked about, Leo IX, the one that stabilizes the papacy after the German emperors intervene. It's Leo IX's legates, while they are on a diplomatic mission to Constantinople, they're undiplomatic indeed and end up excommunicating the Patriarch of Constantinople, who excommunicates them, and that's sort of the formal break in 1054. It's happening right at that beginning point of when the Reformed papacy is about to take hold, and you can imagine as that trajectory continues to Innocent III, there has been really no impetus on the part of the Byzantines to reconcile. They would have to reconcile by admitting ever-increasing degrees of papal supremacy. There's going to be a lot of complexity to the imperial houses. So the rulers, the royal house or the imperial house of Constantinople at this time is the Komnenoi, House Komnenos, and the Angelos. And so I just liked this. I found, when I Googled this chart, I found that a guy named Pauwi Keldrin had made them in Lego. So I thought this was really kind of cool. But I don't know if you can actually even read it though on this chart. So it depends on if you're watching on a phone or if you're watching on a computer. But I won't follow it in a lot of detail. But essentially, the Byzantine prince who is trying to persuade the crusade is down in the lower left corner. Where's his dad? Well, anyway, the point of it is that the Angelos are interrelated to an earlier house, the Komnenos, and they're all of them, if you'll notice, intermarried with Western princesses. So one of the emperors is married to Maria of Antioch, so one of the princesses of the Crusader states. Another here is married to Agnes of France, the daughter of the King of France, and so on. So we'll get into that. So there is a major background of instability. So I showed how Byzantium is declining. It's also declining at the center as the dynasties, or the rivals for control, are fighting with each other. So if we just look back a couple decades, in 1180, one of these last of the Komnenoses, Alexius II, took the Byzantine throne at the age of 10 when his father died. And so then as a young emperor, he is under the guardianship of his mother, Maria of Antioch, a Latin princess from one of those Crusader states, the Principality of Antioch. So the Greek population of Constantinople and the empire was very dissatisfied with the kind of favoritism that she seemed to be showing towards the Latins. There was a huge, as these mercantile traders from Italy had established commercial quarters in Constantinople and had even numbered some maybe 60,000 of the 400,000 inhabitants of Constantinople were Latin. And so while there is this guardianship of Maria of Antioch, her son's exiled cousin, Andronicus, returns from his exile, and kind of simultaneously there is a massacre of the city's Latin inhabitants. And so, like I say, if there were 60,000, maybe not that many, but were massacred, they fled or were sold into slavery, causing a big, very big bad blood between the Italian mercantile republics and the Byzantines. So Andronicus this elderly cousin who has come in at the time of the massacre. He initially poses as his young cousin's guardian, but he takes control of the empire and rules from behind, and even has the young puppet emperor have to condemn his own mother to death, and so she's executed. Shortly after, he himself usurps the throne, and he has Alexius II Komnenos killed. The 65-year-old Andronicus then marries his young cousin's 12-year-old betrothed princess, so Agnes, the daughter of King Louis VII, who had been betrothed, like I say. And then finally, in this very brief reign that Andronicus has, which is a little bit of a reign of terror, where it begins in massacre and includes having his own family member, co-emperor, killed. He faces a massive invasion by the Norman king of Sicily. So the kingdom of Sicily attempted to conquer the Byzantine Empire and simply rule it. And so William II sent 80,000 men and 200 ships in order to accomplish this. So the Fourth Crusade is not the first group of Westerners who consider conquering, or even have tried pretty seriously to conquer, the Byzantine Empire as it is clearly tottering and weak. So the unpopular Andronicus then is toppled by a popular revolt in Constantinople, which brings another distant cousin, Isaac II Angelos, to the throne. Isaac is able to rally the empire, lead an army, and successfully routs the Sicilian invasion, which secures his throne and establishes the new Angelos dynasty. And so he becomes emperor for 10 years. A couple years in, he makes a deadly agreement with the Venetians. So the Venetians had been outraged by the massacre, but the Latins who had been in the city had more or less been in charge of, they had essentially usurped the entire commercial capacity of the empire, and the empire is now broke and without any ability to conduct trade and things. And so in exchange for favorable new trade rights given to the Venetians, he also effectively outsources the role of the Byzantine navy to the Venetians. So the Byzantines stop spending any money on their own navy, and the Venetians act as the Byzantine navy upon request for the emperor. You can imagine how safe an idea that is to have an entirely mercenary navy that has its own interests at heart. So again, this emperor, during his reign, the Bulgarians, the Vlachs, the Serbs, they revolt and gain their independence. And so Isaac tries to make a deal with the king of Hungary to counterattack, but as he's out of the city on a hunting trip, he's unexpectedly deposed by his own elder brother, who now becomes the Emperor Alexius III Angelos. Alexius is able to capture his brother, has him blinded, which is the traditional way that Byzantine emperors are deposed, because theoretically, if you've been blinded, you can't be on the throne anymore. And he throws him in the dungeon. So this is the emperor Isaac, who has the son who meets the crusaders, right? So his son Alexius, who escapes this deposition and makes his way as the brother-in-law of Philip of Swabia, he makes his way to Zara, and this is the guy who is they're trying to restore this blinded King Isaac II, or Emperor Isaac II Angelos. So the Doge was very aware of all the political realities of Constantinople, including its coffers. And so the Doge, would have known that there's no way that this young Byzantine prince would ever be able to fulfill the terms that he'd offered the crusade. So Byzantium's treasury was absolutely empty. So he couldn't possibly pay back the debt, even if they were to take, even if he were to be restored to the throne, or his dad was to be restored to the throne, much less pay the rest of the money to the Crusaders. Nor could he ever, get the empire to submit to papal supremacy, because the population was just increasingly hostile to Latins and the Western Church. Nevertheless, the Doge gave his full-throated support to the plan and voted and encouraged the Crusaders to divert to Constantinople to restore Isaac II to the throne. And so let's zoom in again on this really good map that we found. You can see this is the route of the crusade. The main route is the big red line that goes from Venice to Zadar in Hungary, and then down the coast around Greece, making its way ultimately to Constantinople. All of these other lines are all of the smaller numbers of crusaders who defect along the way and who make their way to Acre in order to try to do a real crusade instead of being hijacked and having a crusade against fellow Christians. And so the Venetian fleet successfully ferries the Crusaders from Zara to Constantinople, and they arrive in June of 1203. So Constantinople is this amazing city, heavily fortified. Nevertheless, it was very lightly garrisoned. So it had been, one, the empire was pretty broke, and two, though the main troops are defending the frontiers. And so normally, if they get a lot of advance notice that a whole bunch of, let's say, Bulgarians are going to come down and attack Constantinople, they can bring troops back, if they break through the frontiers and man the whole defenses. Or same thing if a whole bunch of Turks are coming from Anatolia and attacking. In both of those cases, the city was also fairly well defended because the Bulgarians and the Turks didn't have the kind of boats that you need, the kind of ships you need. So in order to take Constantinople, you have to attack it with both a naval force and a land force, because otherwise, if you don't have a naval force, they are able to just be supplied by water. And again, if you don't have a land force, the same thing. So you have to have both. At this point, because of the deal that Isaac II, this deposed emperor that they're trying to put back on the throne, had made with Venice, the Byzantine navy was down to about 20 galleys, and most of these were even judged inoperable. The number of troops in the garrison was maybe about 15,000, including the highly trained Varangian Guard. These had descended from the kind of the Eastern European Vikings from Kiev and things, but had swelled now, was mostly made up of Anglo-Saxon nobles who had left England in the wake of the Norman conquest. And so these were highly trained and skilled troops, but not a lot of them. So the Crusaders landed in Galata, which is a unwalled suburb. It had been one of the places, the Genoese quarter, one of the places where merchants would set up anyway. And so they're able to land there without opposition, without serious opposition. So here's kind of the sequence of events. The Crusaders demanded that Emperor Alexius III, the current emperor, resign. There's a lot of Alexioses, but anyway, this is the older Alexius, that he resign from the throne in favor of his blinded brother Isaac and his nephew, this younger Alexius, this prince that had found the Crusaders at Zara. Both the emperor and the population refused, so the Crusaders began their siege. They took the tower in Galata, in that unwalled suburb. It still had a very major castle, a tower, a fortified tower, which they took. And the tower had control of the great chain that was drawn across the Golden Horn that protected the navy. So you can see where that where it says Galata there, and that bit of water is called the Golden Horn, and the navy is up protecting there, so they weren't able to sail in and attack that part of the city, the weakest part of the city, as long as the chain was up. So with the chain down, the Venetian fleet destroyed what little remained of the Byzantine navy, and they began attacking the city at the weakest point of the seawall by the palace of the Blachernae, where while the Crusaders attacked the great Theodosian walls from the land. And so kind of see here on the map where the red is the place where the Crusaders on the land and the Venetians are attacking by sea. So while the first attacks are repulsed, the Venetians were able to break through and take control of about 25 towers. The Varangians that had been defending against the Crusaders kind of switched over to repulse the Venetians, but the Venetians successfully were able to set fire to a bunch of the city. This is not that great fire that we mentioned, but there's actually 3 major fires that take place while the Crusaders are in Constantinople. The Byzantine emperor led his army out of the walls to engage the Crusaders, and while he outnumbered them, his courage failed, and he actually returned to the city without actually engaging or having a battle at all. These 2 events caused the morale of the army and the Byzantines in general to collapse. And so the Byzantines themselves deposed their emperor, Alexius III. They released the blinded Isaac II from his prison, from the dungeon, and returned him to the throne along with that young Alexius, the prince with the Crusaders, Alexius IV. The city, now having met the overt demands of the Crusaders, the Crusaders were now forced to end their attack without taking the city. They got what they said they wanted, and so that means that they don't get to conquer the city. However, once he was enthroned as emperor, the young Alexius IV, found himself completely unable to fulfill any of the promises that he'd made to the Crusaders. As we said right at the beginning, there was no way any of this could happen. So his treasury is empty. He can't pay the Venetians. He can't pay the Crusaders. And the Byzantines were in no mood at this point to end the schism and submit to papal supremacy and to change their way of worship to Latin Rite and all that kind of thing. So as Alexius attempted to raise the funds that he owed, the Venetians and Crusaders became more and more hated by the locals, and Alexius made himself ever more popular with his subjects. A nobleman from the Ducas family, who's also named Alexius, and now we're going to have another Alexius, he formed a conspiracy against the new emperor and succeeded in overthrowing him. He put him in prison and had him strangled. When the Crusaders learned that their patrons had been killed, Isaac II by this point had also died, possibly of natural causes, but just as likely poisoned. The Crusaders once again lay siege to the city. So the city's defenses are now organized by the new emperor, Alexius V, Alexius Ducas. Once again, the Crusaders attacked in exactly the same way and breached the walls and completely sacked and looted the city the way it was described at the very beginning when I read the Byzantine chronicler just talking about the destruction of the city. In the course of all of the attacks, there were 3 major fires that left much of the city destroyed. Everything that wasn't, including things that were nailed, everything that was nailed down was looted by the Crusaders. Very famously, the 4 horses that were in the Hippodrome in Constantinople were taken by the Venetians, are now in St. Mark's in Venice. And St. Mark's also has one of the most amazing collections of Byzantine art because they grabbed everything that they could. So what's the aftermath and legacy of the Fourth Crusade? So having taken the city for themselves, the Crusaders decided that the schism was over. They imposed a new Latin patriarch of Constantinople, and everywhere where they controlled, they replaced Greek clergy and church leaders with new Latin leaders. The Crusaders divided the spoils, so they needed to make a new emperor of Constantinople, a new East Roman emperor, but now a Latin emperor essentially of Constantinople. Boniface of Montferrat thought that it should be him. He was the leader of the crusade, but the Venetians, who had enough of the vote that they could veto him, decided that they didn't want somebody as powerful and as closely connected to them, an Italian, to be in charge. And so instead they picked one of the other crusade leaders, Baldwin of Flanders, who became the new Latin emperor. Boniface of Montferrat is given a major fief, so he became king of Thessalonica. So you can see that in these successor states, as the East Roman Empire is carved up, the emperor himself gets Constantinople and this sort of yellow area. Then Boniface, who becomes the new king of Thessalonica, gets the purple area, Thessalonica being the second most important city in the empire. Meanwhile, two other major fiefs are set up, the Duchy of Athens and the Principality of Achaia. And these become actually the longest lasting of the Crusader states in Greece. And if you've ever seen the play A Midsummer Night's Dream, the Theseus is described as the Duke of Athens, and this is a reference to the fact that the medieval title of the Frankish Principality it makes Athens a duchy, and that dates from this. Meanwhile, some of the Greeks remained unconquered, and so different remnants of the imperial court and different scions of the imperial dynasties established successor states. So you can see up in the northern coast of Anatolia, an empire of Trebizond is established. In the area immediately between the Latin Empire, the yellow area, and the Turks, the green area, there is this pink area called the Empire of Nicaea that has its capital now at Nicaea, that place where that first Christian council is had, so very close to Constantinople, but outside of it. And then a final successor state is in the very west of Greece, the Despotate of Epirus. That's that green area on the western side of Greece. And so the Greeks regroup and try to maintain independent states, but you can see very, very tiny independent states. Ultimately, both the Latin Empire part and Thessalonica are almost immediately bankrupt and are unable to maintain themselves because the wealth of the whole thing, the lion's share, actually is given to who? The Venetians, the guys who had established the entire thing. And so all of the islands, everything that's purple, and all of these different ports and everything like that, those all go to Venice. That's Venice's share. So they got everything that they wanted, and even at the end, the Doge took the title, or he would boast that he was the lord of 3/8 of the Roman Empire, because he got a 3/8 share, or all the best bits, other than control of Constantinople, and he did get a part of Constantinople, one of the best parts around Hagia Sophia. So the Venetians did pretty well for themselves. Everybody else really didn't, and slowly over time, as the Latin Empire declined over the next 60 years, the Empire of Nicaea, the main Greek successor state, did the best and grew, even gained some territories against the Seljuks. They ultimately were able to retake Constantinople and reestablish the Byzantine Empire. But the Byzantine Empire in its final stage, which had, it was sort of like Italy after the fall of, not the fall of the Western Empire, but after the fall of the Ostrogoths. Now this is Byzantines after the fall of Constantinople. The recapturing of Constantinople, it's never the same, and they're never able to regain control, for example, of their of the mercantile trade and everything like that, which continues to be dominated by the Italian states until the whole thing is taken by the Turks, and even then the Turks have trouble fighting big wars against the Venetians, and so on. So one of the legacies is that this is really the death blow to the East Roman Empire, the last continuous successor of the Roman Empire. Again, a successor state in Nicaea comes and reclaims the territory and ekes out another couple centuries, but it really more or less mostly ends here. It doesn't recover. That said, the empire had been in very serious decline. It might have had another whole life in it, but it maybe hadn't. There had been a lot of potential. There had been many times when there was potential that somebody would have conquered it, and certainly the King of Sicily on a couple occasions looked like they were pretty close to doing it. Later on, it's just a matter of somebody wanting to conquer it enough and contracting with the Venetians or the Genoese. In other words, you just need a navy and you need an army, and the navy and army, no matter how powerful the walls of Constantinople are, if you don't have a significant enough navy and army to defend it, you aren't going to be able to defend it. So probably, this is a counterfactual, we only know what happened. Probably the empire would have fallen anyway, and so that's perhaps not the biggest consequence and legacy. But the fact that it was Crusaders that did have a permanent legacy. So this is what finalized the schism. So there is no way, the betrayal from the Westerners, the Christians on a crusade, Latins conquering and trying to exterminate by force the Orthodox Church to force its assimilation. That meant reconciliation was probably permanently impossible, or became permanently impossible. Another consequence was this caused crusade creep. So Innocent III, this powerful pope who set this whole crusade in motion, who claimed such great powers, he also now begins initiating crusades against heretics. So the Albigensian Crusade, the crusade against the Cathars in southern France, and so on. So there are lots and lots of different legacies and consequences, of this crusade, which I've dubbed here the worst crusade. So I'm going to get a drink of water as we see if Leandro has your questions and comments collected. First, I want to thank people for their support. I want to thank JM and Kat Givens and Dave Anderson and Mike R. and Marco Conti and Taboo Cat and James Sweeney and Cobalt George. Thanks so much for your support. That's allowing us to keep focusing our focus on this, all the support that our listeners give. Cobalt George asks, did the conquest of such a mighty city gain the Crusaders martial virtue, or would the defilement of the sacred negate any valor they might have displayed in the exploit? I think that there was an awareness at the time that this was not that this wasn't a glorious thing. So unlike the other Crusades, as modern people, I think we don't have the kind. We have a disconnect. The Crusaders are very excited when they first conquered Jerusalem, and even though they massacre everybody in the city, which now makes us completely disconnected, I think, in the modern times from the medieval values. And so then, in other words, the Crusaders went home being very proud of that accomplishment, or stayed there being very proud of that accomplishment and boasting of it. And the sources all are jubilant and excited. The sources in this case are melancholy. So a couple of them, might have boasted that they accomplished amazing things, but on the other hand, this was also seen not as what you're supposed to do in a crusade. And so, and certainly even, the Pope is actually even opposing it and excommunicating them at different times. He opposed also the attack on Constantinople, although he had, again, enough, he had enough realpolitik sensibilities that once it was actually conquered, he approved all of the things that happened. So he approved replacing the Eastern Church with Latin Church and all of that kind of thing. So it wasn't, I think, seen in this case, unlike the other Crusades, where killing non-Christians was seen as a big virtue. This wasn't as much to boast about. Lewis Kaplan, thank you for your support. Tabukat says, was there any repercussions for the Crusaders that returned, or were they hailed as heroes? Did the Pope say anything about this failure? Yeah, so I was just kind of talking about that. So the Pope, like I said, he was initially opposed. Once it happened, he was just as happy as anybody to take advantage of it. So now he definitely doesn't have a rival in the Patriarch of the East. He's now, again, much more powerful. He is able to be, the Latin emperors who are so poor and weak. The next decades, they essentially have no income. They have nothing. They're just hawking whatever other treasures that they were still left in Constantinople in order to try to raise armies, in order to maintain their control of Constantinople, which is becoming ever more depopulated and ruined. And so, the Pope is happy that he has no rivals, and that the new kingdoms that are set up are more or less dependent on them. But he also would like the Venetians to be more obedient to him, and so there were those kind of repercussions for them. For the Crusaders that returned, a bunch of them perhaps returned with more wealth and loot than normally happened on a crusade. So a lot of times when a crusader would return, they might have lost, everything along the way and been in terrible debt sometimes. And so this maybe was a little different, but you maybe have less religious bragging rights, but maybe just as much bragging rights in a tavern where you're talking about martial exploits that were amazing. Daryl Scott, thank you for your support donation. Mike R. asks, was the Children's Crusade truly as bad as it's rumored to be? Why would any military strategist think that this would work? So Mike, we're going to have a lecture in a few weeks or month or so on the Children's Crusade and actually popular crusading in general, and a lot of understanding of the Children's Crusade, is mostly all mythical. So we have a very like a literary story of the Children's Crusade, which is almost like the story of the Pied Piper. In fact, the Children's Crusade is probably primarily a popular crusade, which is to say, it's not so much that it's children. There may be some of the primary speakers that are inspiring it or preaching it are children, but it's primarily non-soldiers. So the idea of it is that like peasants are trying to go on a crusade. It's not as bad necessarily as it's rumored to be, in the sense that the idea of the children all marching off to the sea, and then all of them getting sold into slavery is part of the literary story, the myth. We don't actually know in a lot of cases what happened. Actually, a lot of the peasants and the children probably just went home having accomplished nothing. But some of them definitely had bad ends, and so it was certainly not anything that anybody wanted. So what would any military strategist think that this would work? Nobody thought that would work. Nobody wanted them to be. The Children's Crusades and all of these peasant and popular crusades are simply unauthorized. So the popes are trying to get the knights to go off on crusade, but they get such a fervor among the people. There's popular piety, and the people decide that they want to get involved in it too, and so then they all get together and march off towards the sea, and they, of course, they don't have any boats, and so they're not going to be able to do anything. James Sweeney, before the 1054 schism, why did many Catholic states such as Venice, Hungary, and the Normans go to war with the Byzantines? Was it political, economic, or was there proto-sectarian motivation as well? It was, I would say, primarily and almost entirely political and economic. So the Venetians, it's economic. I mean, they're at war in part at a certain point to maintain their autonomy, but in general they get their autonomy by just being well defended and far away. The Normans go to war with the Byzantines because the Byzantines, when the Normans are conquering southern Italy, the Byzantines have provinces still in southern Italy. And so the Normans take over the Lombard principalities, but they also take over the Byzantine provinces. And so they've already got and they also take over then Arab Sicily. But they get a taste for fighting the Byzantines that way. And then once they have control, they have their principality and they control all of southern Italy, then they look over at the Byzantines and say, hey, that empire isn't that much bigger or more powerful than what we have, and we're better fighters. Maybe we could conquer that. And so they made a couple major attempts to take it, and it could have happened. And so that's a political opportunism, not sectarian at all. Raymond, for example, the Normans, they're ruling over a very diverse kingdom they are fully tolerant, or have Greek clergy and Latin clergy and Muslims and Jews all living in their kingdom and working for them. Raymond Ortiz says, did the infamous Knights Templar emerge from the Crusades? Yes. So the Knights Templar are one of the religious orders. So it is essentially taking the idea of monks and then having knights essentially take vows to be monks. And so essentially you're of a knight who is taking a vow of celibacy and not about, so it's not about owning your own land and castles, but the order ends up having vast lands and vast castles, and the kind of monk knights, the Templars and the Hospitallers and the Sword Brothers and all the other orders are defending the Crusader kingdoms originally, and they're some of the most effective fighters at doing it because they're able to bring they're very popular and they bring lots of wealth from Europe, and they're very consistent. So the Crusades, when they come, you have this giant army and it's only there for a little while, and then it goes away, and then all the Muslims are still there, and so they are able to fight back and overrun it. Well, the Templars and the Hospitallers build giant castles, and they're able to be much more stable than Crusaders because they stay there. And so the Templars did absolutely emerge from the Crusades. And the reason why they become infamous is that they become centers of banking. And so as they own lots of property, and as they and the property becomes a place where you can deposit money. And so if you're going to go on a crusade or a trip to the Holy Land, you can potentially just give your money to a castle in France and get a banknote essentially, and go to the Templars in the Holy Land, and they can give you money there, as opposed to having the problem of carrying it. And then when the Crusader states fall, the Templars are still around, and they're in Europe, and they have all of their rich castles and all their money and everything like that. And so the King of France decides that he wants to take all of their money and lands and castles. And so he makes up a lot of rumors about them in order to discredit them and bring them down. So they're not really infamous in the sense that they don't really do those things that they're infamously known for, but that's part of their ending. Cat Givens, the Crusaders who defected and wouldn't attack the fellow Christians, did they go someplace, attack someplace, or did they go home? Some of them went home. A bunch of them went to, made it to the Crusader kingdom of Jerusalem. They made it to Acre. At first, they couldn't attack anybody because the locals there said that you didn't bring enough knights, and if we attack the Muslims, if we break the truce now with this so few knights, then we're going to get attacked in return, and they have a big army. Eventually, they had enough knights, and they decided to break the truce, and they attacked. Didn't accomplish much, and the Muslims fought them back, and they lost some of their boats and things like that. Donnie Ling Gringo in Brazil says, did the Fourth Crusaders move on to Jerusalem, or did they take the loot and sail into the sunset to Venice? Some of them moved on and went there, like I said, and they didn't accomplish much, but mostly they had to stay because some of them, they had a lot of loot and they had to go home, or they divided the lands, and so some of them now were given fiefs and started to be parts of the Latin Empire, or the Kingdom of Thessalonica, or the Principality of Achaia, or the Duchy of Athens. And so some of the knights stayed and were enfeoffed with land, and that's where they eked out their. I mean, in some cases, for centuries, there are Frankish noble houses that were ruling in Greece, ruling over Greeks in Greece. Long live the King of Nil, the King of Nil. Can you speak to the economic and demographic conditions which might have contributed to the Crusades, such as consistently bad harvests, youth bulge, etc.? It wasn't. I don't think it wasn't as much the bad harvest. It was a youth bulge, and so what had happened in the West had been relatively depopulated in the early Middle Ages. And then it started to really rise, and its population exploded, its economics exploded, and it was really growing. There were, as a result, extra younger sons of the noble class. The nobles were not able to enfeoff all of their sons, and so being able to send a lot of them away on crusade was a wonderful way for them to do something. And then, like I say, simultaneously, there was just a rise of the West economically, which the maritime republics exemplified. And so as the Italians took control of all of the shipping routes and started, took away essentially from Muslim traders and also Greek traders, and now started doing all of the trading kind of directly with the Silk Road all the way across. This just brought lots of wealth and prosperity, and that kind of fueled the Crusades economically. But it was also a very seriously religiously motivated. So it's not only demographics allowed them to actually accomplish anything, and ultimately the wealth followed, and so that was motivating certainly the ability to have these navies. But a lot of the knights, including the Knights Templar, people who devoted themselves to took religious vows to do that, were actually very religiously motivated too. So, user voice in his head thinks I'm being partial because. Leandro says, because I'm calling the Eastern Roman Empire a successor to Rome, but he points out that it was Rome. Can you speak to that? So I mentioned that the Eastern Empire had continuity, with the original Roman state. So Constantine had moved his capital to Constantinople. And so under Constantine, the whole empire was united and ruled from Constantinople. There were later divisions of the empire. The empire had been divided into parts under Diocletian. It's later divided again under Theodosius. And so there's not enough, the emperors are military leaders, and you can't defend all of the frontiers from just the base in Constantinople, east and west. And so what ends up happening is that they establish a second imperial court, a second emperor, and the second emperor in the west rules from Ravenna, Milan, and Trier, and so that they can defend the frontier from the Germanic tribes that are across the Danube and Rhine frontiers, especially the Rhine frontier. And then from Constantinople, which is a much better and more fortified place to rule from than Ravenna or Trier or Milan, the Eastern emperors also continue, and they are defending against Persia and a much smaller frontier against the Germans on the Danube. And so they are in a stronger place, but they are Rome, and the Western Empire is Rome. So the city of Rome is in the Western Empire, but it's really not the capital at all. It is just a great city that had a historically had been the center of this empire that was created. In other words, it was originally from Rome, but Rome did such a good job of creating its identity. So people first aspired to Roman citizenship, then when everybody was a citizen, people all across the empire considered themselves Romans. And so the Easterners did not call themselves Greek, they called themselves Romans. The Westerners did not call themselves Italians or Gauls, really, they called themselves Romans. So in both cases, they're Romans. The Roman Empire in the West collapsed and became the various successor Germanic kingdoms. So Rome is not part of the Eastern Empire, but the Eastern Empire is still, is still Roman, even though it doesn't own Rome. So even though, so the identity of both peoples continues to use the word Rome, even whether or not you own Rome. So if that makes it clear. And so just because so historians, it's very hard if we called everybody who called themselves Rome, then everybody would just always be using this word. That's why historians use terms like the Holy Roman Empire or the Roman Empire of the Germans, the Western Empire, and the Greek Empire or the Byzantine Empire, the Empire of the East, just so we can tell the difference. Ultimately, even the Turks, when they have the Sultanate of Rum, that means Rome. They call themselves the Sultans of Rome, even though because they own part of Anatolia. Anatolia was Rome or Romania. The word Romania means Rome. The Romanians are saying that they're the Romans. There's an area in Greece and Bulgaria called Rumelia, because that area is where the Romans live. And so I'm just trying to say here that Rome had an identity. Rome had multiple heirs. There are significant successors in the Byzantine emperors and also in the Western emperors, the Frankish and German emperors in the Middle Ages. Miguel Angelo says, did the sack of Constantinople by the Crusade influence the cultural renaissance of Europe, or was this only after the fall of the city by the later Muslim conquest? So it's actually, there's actually not as many texts that are being, surprisingly, that are taken as you'd think. So there are multiple points of contact that the Latin West, which is having a cultural revolution, this is the time when, for example, the universities are taking off and the Aristotelian corpus is being recaptured or refound by the West or reacquired by the West. But the biggest place of transmission is actually not the multicultural kingdom of Sicily, and it's not the Crusader states where the Crusaders are fighting the Easterners and Muslims. It's actually in Spain, and so the bulk of the texts that are being transmitted are being sent through Spain, and I think this is in part because the Muslim culture in Spain actually was highly sophisticated and also important in terms of kind of the philosophical commentary, and there was just a bigger apparatus for translating books from Arabic into Latin, and then also from Greek into Latin from the Muslim side. I'm sorry, from the Spanish side. It was happening in Sicily, and it was happening here in Constantinople, but I think that there is an appetite for all of that, and the biggest path is probably coming through Spain. Cobalt George says, I'm giving an academic presentation at the end of the month, and I'm nervous. Can you give any advice about how to prepare for these lectures? Well, it's, Cobalt, George, it's going to depend on your own style and technique and how you organize information personally. So my method is I have a really strong retention of texts that I read. And so in the week or so leading up to one of these lectures, I take as my reading materials different histories or even primary sources of it, and I just kind of devour those without actually starting to write. And so I put all of that information from the sources into my brain, and then I sort it out, and when it gets a lot closer. And so as a result of that, and so for example, the way I do it is actually I make all the slides the day of. I'm not telling you to do that, but I just do that because I have to do one of these every week. So that allows me to have a lot of information on a particular topic crammed into my head when I'm actually giving the lecture, and that's how I'm able to answer questions even. I mean, in some of these cases, this is stuff I know about generally, but I also have refreshed a lot of it very recently, so within the last week or two. All right, well, thank you so much. Don't forget to like, share this video, subscribe to the channel. We appreciate donations in the YouTube chat that you've been doing or at our website, centerplace.ca. Every bit of the support helps us bring more lectures to you. Next week, it's not the Muslim view of Jesus next week, right? It's what is it?
No. What the Bible doesn't
yeah. The next week the misinterpretation of the Book of Revelation. So despite what people think about what the Book of Revelation says, we're going to look at what the Book of Revelation actually says. So we'll do a deep dive on the apocalypse next week, and then the following week we'll do the Muslim view of Jesus. All right, thank you. Good night.